Hi, everybody. Welcome to Miss Peggy's Story Time and Chapter 9 of Pilgrim's Progress. This is going to be quite the chapter. I'm looking forward to getting into it with you. You remember what went on in Chapter 8, where we met Mr. By-Ends and his friends? Oh, my, what a sorry lot they were. We want to be careful not to get involved with filthy lucre and the desire for all the things of this world if it means giving up Christ to do it. They were willing to make any kind of compromises, weren't they? But it didn't go well with them in the end. They fell down into that silver mine that Demas had in the path. They were lured out of the way by a desire to get rich. And they wouldn't be the only ones who've ever done that in our history. So we want to be careful that we put the right things first. Jesus and getting to heaven and obeying his word, reading his Bible, talking to other people about him. Those are much more important than getting rich. Oh, yeah. Okay, well, let's read chapter 9 now, which is called Taking the Easy Path. Then I saw that the pilgrims went on their way toward a pleasant river that King David called the River of God, but the Apostle John called the River of Life. They were delighted to find that the way led right along the bank of the river, and so they drank from it to refresh their weary spirits. On both sides of the river stood green trees with all kinds of fruit, and they ate the leaves too to prevent sickness as well as other health benefits. There were also beautifully adorned meadows full of lilies on both sides of the river, and the meadows were green all year round. Feeling safe, they lay down in the meadow to sleep, and when they woke, they gathered fruit from the trees, and they drank from the river once again, and then lay down to sleep again. And this continued for several days. And then they sang, "Look how these crystal streams do glide to comfort pilgrims by the highway side. The green meadows with their fragrant smell produce dainties for them. And who can tell what pleasant fruit and leaves these trees do yield? We'll soon sell all that he may buy this field." And when they were ready to resume their journey, since they hadn't quite gotten through the meadow, they ate and drank and left. But before they had gone too far, the river and the way split off from each other in different directions. They were sad, but they did not dare venture off the way, even though the path became rough and their feet became sore from walking on it. It wasn't long before they became weary and discouraged, and they longed for an easier path. A little way ahead of them, on the left side of the road, there was a set of steps built over a fence that bordered a meadow, which was called Bypath Meadow. And here's a picture of it. And there's the little steps that would take you up over this fence and into Bypath Meadow. And you can tell that the road that the pilgrims are traveling on is kind of rough and hard on the feet. Lots of little stones and ups and downs. And this little this little break in a wall is called a stile in English, stile, not like the latest style, which is style. It means, fashions and things like that. But a stile is a little break in a wall that has steps that go up over it, or sometimes it's just very narrow and a person can squeeze through it. But the thing that the farmer wants to be sure is that his animals don't go through it. So he makes those steps steep and hard for a person to climb over, but it can be done because even today, if you go hiking in England and you walk across farmers' fields, they're happy for you to do it as long as you don't mess with their crops or their animals. And you can get from field to field by going through or over one of these stiles. They're very useful. So anyway, Pilgrim and Christian and Faithful, no, not Faithful, Hopeful. Christian and Hopeful were going along the path beside the lake and then the river, and then the path split off from the river, and the path that they were on was really rough. And so as they were going along, they were getting really discouraged with this rough path they were walking on, and they came to a stile that led over the fence into a lovely smooth green meadow that was right beside the path. And Christian said to Hopeful, "If this meadow runs along beside the way, let's cross over and walk in there." And so he hurried over the steps to investigate, And sure enough, he found a path on the other side of the stile that seemed to run parallel to their own. "This is exactly what I was hoping for," said Christian, pointing over the steps. "This path will be much easier. Come on, Hopeful, let's cross over." Hopeful was hesitant, and he said, "But how do we know that this path will not lead us away from the way?" "Oh, that's not likely," said Christian, beginning to climb over the step. "Look, this path is parallel to ours, and it's only on the other side of the fence." So Hopeful was soon persuaded by Christian to follow him over the steps, and together they traveled the new path, finding it much easier on their feet. They haven't excuse me. They had not traveled very far when they spotted a man walking in front of them, whose name was Vain Confidence. They called out to him and asked him where this path led. "Oh, to the Celestial City," he replied. "See," said Christian, smiling confidently at Hopeful. "Didn't I tell you? This confirms that we are heading in the right direction." "I'm so glad to have a... Let's see, is this right? Yes." They began to follow Vain Confidence, but as night came and it grew very dark, they lost sight of him. It was so dark that Vain Confidence couldn't see the path in front of him and fell into a deep pit. This pit was a trap prepared by the king of those grounds to catch fools who ventured into his property. And when he fell, his body was broken into pieces. Christian and Hopeful heard Vain Confidence fall and called out to see how he was doing, but there was no reply. They only heard loud groaning. "Where are we now?" said Hopeful, visibly concerned. Christian stayed silent with the fearful realization that he had led Hopeful off the way and into danger. And suddenly it began to rain, thunder and lightning in a most dreadful manner. The rain came down in streams and began to flood the path. Hopeful groaned inwardly and thought, "If only I had stayed on the way." "Who would have thought that this path would lead us off the way?" said Christian, as his confidence began to fade. "Well, I had my fears from the very beginning, and I expressed those to you with a gentle warning," Hopeful said, obviously irritated. "Perhaps I should have been clearer, but you are more mature in the faith than I." "Oh, you're such a good friend. Please don't be offended," said Christian with sorrow in his voice. "I am sorry that I led you off the way and exposed you to this danger. Please forgive me, Hopeful. I didn't do it with evil intent." Hopeful placed his arm on Christian's shoulder, even as they were now becoming soaked from the rain. "Say no more. I forgive you. I have no doubt that this will be for our good." "I am so glad to have a merciful companion with me," Christian then immediately said. "But let's not stand here any longer. We're in danger. Let's try to go find our steps back to the right way." "Well, if that's the case, then I'll lead the way," said Hopeful, and he started to turn back. "Oh, no," said Christian, grabbing Hopeful's arm. "Please let me go first. Then, if we encounter danger, I'll be the first one to deal with it, since it's my fault for leading us off the way." "Absolutely not," said Hopeful, raising his voice to be heard over the rain and thunder. "Your leading us would not be a good idea, since your mind is still troubled, and you might lead us even further off the way." Then they heard an encouraging voice saying, "Let your heart be toward the highway, even the way that you formerly went in. Turn and go back again." But by this time the floodwaters had risen much higher, making traveling back to the way very dangerous. It was then that I understood that it's easier to leave the way when you're still on it than it is to get back onto it once you've left it. Still, they made every effort to return, but it was so dark, and the floodwaters had risen so high that they nearly drowned 9 or 10 times trying to return. Here's a picture we can see of them, and you can see the floodwaters up ahead of them. They're in a dangerous place. Even with all their skill and determination, they were still unable to make it back to the steps that night. Eventually, they found refuge under a small shelter and sat down awaiting daybreak, but being exhausted, they fell asleep. Not far from the place where they were lying, there was a castle called Doubting Castle, and Giant Despair, the owner of that castle, got up early in the morning to walk up and down his fields, and he found Christian and Hopeful asleep on his property. And here's a picture of Giant Despair finding the two of them as they're sleeping in that little shelter. Does he look like a nice guy? The Pilgrims were rudely awakened by the gruff and brutal giant demanding, "Where are you from, and what are you doing on my property?" They explained that they were pilgrims who had lost their way. "You are trespassing, and you have no right to trample on and sleep on my property. You must come with me right now." And he forced them to go along with him. They had very little choice, given that he was bigger and stronger, and they could say very little as they knew that they were at fault. The giant drove his prisoners like cattle all the way to his castle and locked them up in a very dark dungeon cell. There we go. There's a picture of the two of them in the dungeon cell. The Christian and Hopeful spirits soon became discouraged in the smelly and nasty cell. They laid there from Wednesday until Saturday without any food or water, light, or even someone to ask them how they were doing. The dungeon was a sinister place, far from any family or friends. It wasn't long before Christian became depressed, knowing that it was his hasty advice that had gotten them into this mess. Giant Despair had a wife named Diffidence. Diffidence, if you look it up in the dictionary, means someone who's shy and not very self-confident and never stands up for themselves. But back in John Bunyan's day, the word diffidence meant that you resented anyone who had any kind of spiritual power, that you were a wicked and evil person, and that you hated Christianity. As the giant was going to bed that evening, he told his wife about what he had done, explaining how he had taken a couple of prisoners and thrown them into his dungeon for trespassing on his property. "What do you think I should do with them?" he asked his wife while getting into bed. Diffidence was very curious about these new prisoners and asked, "Tell me more about them. Who are they? Where did they come from? And where are they going?" The giant told her everything he knew. Already, Diffidence didn't like the sounds of them and quickly offered this advice. "Tomorrow, you should go down to their cells and beat them without mercy." When he got up to them the next morning, he picked up a short, heavy club and went down into the dungeon and began to beat them like dogs, even though they had showed him no disrespect. His attacks were so severe that they couldn't protect themselves or escape. Once he had finished, the giant left them there, and once he had finished, the giant left them there for the rest of the day to grieve and to mourn in pain. So here's a picture of the giant and his wife Diffidence in bed talking about things, and here's a picture over here of the giant beating them with his club. Poor Christian and Hopeful. Looks like he's really giving them a good beating, and they're so small and he's so huge. The next morning, the giant went to the dungeon at the same surly manner as before and noticed how sore they were from the beatings that he had given them yesterday. "Since neither of you are very likely to ever leave this dungeon, your best alternative is to kill yourselves," he said. "You can use a knife, a noose, or have some poison." And he laid those items in the cage for them. "Why do you want to choose to go on living, since your life is now filled with nothing but sorrow?" They begged him to let them go, but that only made the giant furious, and he rushed to kill them. And undoubtedly he would have succeeded, except he fell into one of his seizures, which often happened on a sunny day. During those fits, his hands became temporarily paralyzed, So that left them alone to consider his advice with the tools he had provided. Christian and Hopeful began an intense discussion about whether they should take their own lives as the giant had suggested. Hopeful, said Christian, visibly distraught and rubbing his sore head, what should we do? This is a miserable life to live. For me, I don't know whether it's better to live like this or to die by my own hand. My soul chooses strangling rather than living, and the grave seems a more desirable place than this dungeon. They were in despair, weren't they? They were in Castle Despair, and they're feeling that they've got reason to be in despair. He paused for a moment and lowered his voice and said, "What do you think? Should we take the giant's advice?" In pain, Hopeful eased his back against the cement wall for support as he sat down. It is true that our condition is horrible, and I would welcome death rather than live in this misery forever. But don't forget what the Lord of the country said when we are heading. The Lord of the country where we are heading has said, "Do not murder." This includes another person or by taking the giant's advice and killing yourself. Besides, when you murder someone, you can only commit murder of that person's body, but if you kill yourself, you're killing your body and your soul at the same time. Hopeful could tell that he was starting to get through to Christian, so he continued. And beyond that, since you're talking of an easy grave, have you forgotten that hell is reserved for murderers? For no murderer has eternal life, the Bible tells us. And let us also remember that giant despair does not have control over the law of our Lord. I understand that there have been others like us that have been captured by him, and yet they've escaped. Christian, writhing in pain, he slowly turned himself around and faced Christian. Who knows? Perhaps the God who made this world may cause giant despair to die. Or, at some time or other, he may forget to lock us in. Or, sooner or later, he may have another one of his paralyzing seizures when he's with us and lose the use of his hands again. I can guarantee you that if this happens, I am going to muster up enough courage to manage my own escape. I was a fool not to have tried it earlier. However, my brother, let us be patient and continue to endure. Perhaps a happy release is in our future, but let's not be our own murderers. Hopeful's words helped ease Christian's mind as they continued together in the dark that day, depressed and in pain. As evening approached, the giant went down to the dungeon to see if Christian and Hopeful had taken his advice. And he found them alive, but barely so, as they were malnourished and beaten so badly and had severe wounds that they could hardly breathe. But he did find them alive, and he fell into a furious rage. "Seeing that you have disobeyed my advice, it will now be worse for you than if you had never been born." The giant was seething as he left, slamming the cell door behind him. Instantly, they were filled with fear, and I think Christian fainted. But after coming to, they continued to discuss whether it was best for them to take the giant's advice and end their lives, and once again, Christian was tempted to do so. "Christian, don't you remember how brave you were before?" said Hopeful, doing his best to encourage him. "Apollyon could not hurt you, and you think about how you came through the valley of the shadow of death. Look at all the hardship, the terror, and the grief that you've already experienced. And are you nothing but fear? Remember that I too am in this dungeon with you, and I'm far weaker than you are. This giant has wounded both of us, and has deprived me also, like you, of any water or food or light. But let us exercise just a little bit more patience," persuaded Hopeful. "Remember how courageous you were in Vanity Fair? You were not afraid of the chains, the cage, or even a bloody death. So let us persevere with patience as long as we can, at least to avoid the shame that isn't suitable for a Christian to be found in." Later that night, the giant and his wife were in bed, and she asked him, Did the prisoners take your advice and commit suicide? Here they are in bed again. Can you see that? She's giving him some more advice. Did the prisoners take your advice today and commit suicide? She asked him. No, they are strong scoundrels, he said angrily, as he could not seem to break their spirits. They would choose to stand firm under hardships than to take their own lives. Diffidence, his wife, was beginning to think she would never get rid of Christian and Hopeful, and she said, Tomorrow you must take them into the castle yard and show them the bones and the skulls of those you've already killed, and make them believe that the same thing will happen to them by the end of the week. When the morning came, the giant took Christian and Hopeful out to the castle yard and showed them the remains of other pilgrims, just as his wife had suggested. Here's what the castle yard looked like. What a sight for Christian and Hopeful to look at. Ooh. These were pilgrims just like you once, he said, making a broad gesture into the castle yard. They also trespassed on my property, as you did, and when I saw fit, I tore them to pieces. And within 10 days, I'll do the same to you. Now get back down to your cell again. He beat them all the way back to the dungeon, and they lay down on Saturday in the same miserable condition as before. Night came, and Diffidence and her husband were once again talking about their prisoners. The old giant was amazed that neither his beatings nor his counsel that they should take their own lives had worked. Diffidence began to feel uneasy. I fear they live in hope of being rescued, or have hidden tools on them to pick the locks, and that they will escape from you. You think so, my dear, said the giant curiously. In that case, I will search them in the morning. On Saturday, around midnight, Christian and Hopeful began to pray, and they continued praying until morning had nearly come. Now, a little before dawn, Christian had a sudden revelation and became very excited. What a fool I am, Hopeful. I've been lying in this stinking dungeon when I might as well have been walking free. I have a key in my pocket that I'm sure will open any lock in Doubting Castle. Hopeful could not believe what he was hearing. That's good news, Christian. Pull it out of your pocket and try it right now. Christian took the key and began to try the lock of the dungeon door, whose bolt, as he turned the key, sprang back easily. The cell door opened wide, freeing Christian and Hopeful. Next, they made their way into the castle yard, and that key opened this door as well as the first one. And eventually, they arrived at the iron gate, which also opened for them to allow them to escape. Christian found that lock a little harder to turn, but when it finally did, they threw open the gates and quickly escaped. However, the hinges made such a loud creaking sound that it woke Giant Despair, who jumped out of bed to pursue his prisoners. As he did, he fell into another one of his seizures, making it impossible for him to chase them. He's trying, though. There he comes. After escaping, Christian and Hopeful made it back to the King's Highway, where they were safe once again and out of the giant's jurisdiction. Once they had returned over the steps at the fence, they began to discuss what should be done at those steps to prevent others who came along from falling into the hands of Giant Despair. And they agreed to set up a sign with clear instructions written on it, which said, "Over these steps is the way to Doubting Castle, where the Lord is Giant Despair, who despises the king of the celestial city and decides to kill all who goes there." And as a result of that warning, many pilgrims that came after them read the sign and escaped the danger. And afterwards they sang, "Out of the way we went, and then we found what it was to tread on forbidden ground. Let them who come after us have a care, lest heedlessness make them as we fare. Lest they for trespassing his prisoners are, whose castle is Doubting and whose name is Despair." I'm so glad that Christian and Hopeful found that key. That key was the key to God's promises. And if they had remembered those promises earlier, they could have escaped all the despair and the doubts that filled their mind, the temptation to end their own lives. And God has His Word full of those promises. How do we know what those promises are? We learn them by reading His Word. There are so many of them in the Old Testament and the New Testament. But if you want to get started learning what God's promises are, I suggest you start reading the Gospels and then maybe read the book of Acts. And you'll find a lot of promises too in the book of Psalms if you'd like to read those. But to know them in your heart and in your head would save you from a lot of temptations to despair, to doubt, to give up hope. That's what God gave those precious promises to us for. So it's our duty to learn what they are and to obey them and to use them when we need them. That's what He gave them to us for. Well, it's been good to read this chapter, a little sobering. Giant Despair is nobody that we want to make close acquaintance with, is it? And his wife Diffidence isn't so great either, is she? All right. Thank you for being with me tonight. The next time we read will be chapter 10, and it'll be called The Shepherds in the Mountains. Thank you for coming to be with me for Miss Peggy's Storytime, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.